Hello, this is Miss Schiller, and we're going to read Soldier's Heart by Gary Paulson, which is a historical fiction during the Civil War period. And so if you flip to the first pages, there's a map of the United States, and it talks about where everything was located during the Civil War so that you can refer back to that. And so what we're going to start with is the foreword, which is before Chapter 1. War is always, in all ways, appalling. Lives are stopped in youth, worlds are ended, and even for those who survive, and the vast majority of soldiers who go to war do survive, the mental damage done is often permanent. What they have seen and been forced to do is frequently so horrific and devastating that it simply cannot be tolerated by the human psyche. Now, there is an attempt to understand this form of injury and deal with it. It is called post-traumatic stress disorder by those who try to cure it. They give it a technical name in the attempt to make something almost incomprehensible understandable, in the hope that by doing this, they will make it curable. But in other times and other wars, they used more descriptive terms. In the Second World War, the mental damage was called battle fatigue, and there were rudimentary efforts to help the victims. These usually involved bed rest and the use of sedatives or other drugs. In the First World War, it was called shell shock, based on the damage done by the overwhelming use, for the first time in modern war, of artillery fire against soldiers in stationary positions like trenches. The concussion of exploding incoming rounds, thousands upon thousands of them, often left men deaf and dazed, many of them with a symptom called the 1,000-yard stare. The afflicted were essentially not helped at all and simply sent home to their families to care for. Most were irrational. Many were in a vegetative state. In the Civil War, the syndrome was generally not recognized at all. While the same horrors existed as those in modern war, in some ways they were even worse because the technological aspects of war being born then, the wholesale killing by men using raw firepower, was so new and misunderstood. The same young men were fed into the madness, but in those days there was no scientific knowledge of the mental disorders and no effort was made to help the men who were damaged. Some men came through combat unscathed. Most did not. These men were somehow different from other men. They were said to have soldiers' hearts. And so that's where we begin, which is on June 1861. And that's Chapter 1. He heard it all, Charlie did. Heard the drums and songs and slogans and knew what everybody and his rooster was crowing. There was going to be a shooting war. They were having town meetings and nailing up posters all over Minnesota, and the excitement was so high, Charlie had seen girls faint at the meetings, just faint from the noise and hullabaloo. It was better than a circus, or what he thought a circus must be like. He had never seen one. He'd never seen anything but Winona, Minnesota, and the river 5 miles each way from town. There would be a shooting war. There would be rebels who had violated the law and fired on Fort Sumter, and the only thing they'd respect was steel, it was said. And he knew they were right, and the Union was right, and one other thing they said as well. If a man didn't hurry, he'd miss it. The only shooting war to come in a man's life, and if a man didn't step right along, he'd miss the whole thing. Charlie didn't figure to miss it. The only problem was that Charlie wasn't rightly a man yet, at least not to the Army. He was 15, and while he worked as a man worked in the fields of all of a day and into night, he looked like a man standing tall and just a bit thin with hands so big they covered a stove lid. He didn't make a beard yet, and his voice had only just dropped enough so he could talk with men. If they knew, he thought, if they knew he was but 15, they wouldn't take him at all. But Charlie watched, and Charlie listened, and Charlie learned. Minnesota was forming a volunteer regiment to go off and fight. It would have near on 1,000 men when it was full, men from Winona and Taylor's Falls and Mankato, and as far north as Deerwood and from the capital St. Paul as well. 1,000 men, and Charlie had learned one thing about an army. One part of an army didn't always know the business of another part. The 1,000 men in the regiment would be in companies of 80 to 100 men from each section, and it would be hard for a man to know men who weren't from the same area. Charlie couldn't join where they knew him. Somebody would spill the beans and he'd get sent back or used as a runner or a drummer boy. He wasn't any boy. He was going to sign to fight as a man, and he knew a way to do it. They would gather at Fort Snelling up along the Mississippi. All the companies from all the towns would assemble there before they went off to fight. They'd just take him a walk, Charlie would. He'd take a walk by himself until he was at Fort Snelling, and there he would lie about his age and sign up as a man and get his musket and a uniform and go to see what a war was like. I won't get into any trouble, Ma, he said, wrapping some bread and cold potatoes and half a roast chicken and some tow cotton. Plus, they'll be paying me. I hear they even give $11 a month. I'll send most of it on home to you and Orrin. Orrin was his younger brother. You can use the money and I won't be under your feet all the time. You aren't under my feet. She hated when he talked fast. He always got his way when he talked fast. He'd smile and that cowlick would stand up in the back and he'd talk fast and she couldn't keep him from what he wanted. He was a good boy, as good as they came. But ever since his father Paul had been killed to death by a horse gone mad when a swarm of bees landed on it, Charlie only had to smile and talk fast and he got his way. You haven't ever been under my feet. Same as, he said, shaking his head. I'm always in the way. But best I go off and see what the big fuss is all about. You ain't but a boy. And I've got to be a man sometime. You've said it more than once yourself, Charlie. You said, you've got to be a man. Well, here it is, my chance to be a man. A boy wouldn't go off to earn $11 a month and wear a uniform, only a man. So I'm going to be a man and do what a man can do. And he won. He knew he would, and he did. And he took his bread and cold potatoes and chicken and left home walking down the road for Fort Snelling. And if she had known what was to come of it, if she had known and could tell him what would come of it, she would have fought to drag him back and let the federal government keep their $11 a month. But she also had heard the songs and the slogans and seen the parades, had been to the meetings, and though it was her son Charlie leaving, she did not think it would be so bad. Nobody thought it would be so bad. Nobody thought it could be so bad. And all the officers and politicians and newspapers said it would be a month or two, no longer. And it would all be over by fall. That's the end of chapter 1, so now we're starting chapter 2, Fort Snelling. They didn't have uniforms for him. There was a pair of black pants that were so short his calves showed, a pair of gray socks, and a black felt hat. That was the uniform he received to go for a soldier. The socks and pants were stout, but the hat was cheap. With the first little sprinkle, it sagged around his head and drooped over his face. They took his name. The colonel of the regiment read a list of things he couldn't do: desert his post, traffic with the enemy, steal from his fellow soldiers, act immoral or without decency. And then he signed his name, told them he was 18, and they didn't challenge it, and he was a soldier. He could read and write, Charlie could, though he hadn't had much schooling. His mom had made him stick to reading and writing, and he wrote his letters telling her of how it was to be a soldier. The food is bad, he wrote. Beef so gamey, dogs won't eat it, and hard beans. We boil the beans and use them for a meal. Then use the leftover beans for soup the next day, and on the third day, take any cooked beans that are left, dry them, and crush them and boil them for coffee. The men don't like them much, and there's talk of hanging the commissary officer. It ain't but just talk, but some don't smile when they say it. There wasn't much of a war, Charlie decided early on, but there was a lot of play acting, and once he got inside it, he found it mostly boring. They did something they called drills in the manuals of arms, working in the hot sun in the compound area of Fort Snelling until they were soaked with sweat, and Charlie felt he could snap his rifle from left shoulder heft to right shoulder heft as good as any man in any army had ever done it. They fired some, but there wasn't much ammunition, and when the sergeants tried to make them hit targets a quarter mile off, Charlie nearly laughed. He hunted his whole life and knew about shooting, but the rifles they were issued were 58 caliber rifled muskets that fired a hollow base bullet called a mini ball, named after the Frenchman who had invented it. The rifles thundered but lacked the flat crack of his small bore hunting rifle, and he found that nearly a third of the time the bullet seemed to fly end over end, and it was all he could do was to hit a target 50 yards off. A quarter mile, over 100 yards, seemed silly, but they practiced anyway and stood and fired and dropped to one knee. And then the next rank stood and fired and dropped. They reloaded by biting the end off the paper cartridge, pouring the powder down the bore, and setting the bullet on the powder with the ramrod. Then a cap on the nipple, the hammer back, and fire again. They said a man could do it 3 times a minute, but Charlie somehow never managed more than twice. When they couldn't afford to expend any more live ammunition, they practiced with empty rifles again and again until Charlie was sick to death of the drilling and wheeling and marching and fake loading. It would be different, he thought, if the leaders knew what they were doing. But the officers and sergeants had been civilians like the rest of the men, and mostly had been elected by the men themselves and had to learn as they went along, using any Army manual for close order drill. It seemed all they did was drill and sweat and listen to sergeants and corporals bellowing at them, and as the weeks passed, Charlie grew more and more bored and was beginning to pay attention to his mother's letters. She had taken to thinking of the bad side of the war and was in fear that Charlie would get killed, and wrote 3 times a week. "I know it ain't right," she wrote in one letter, "but you must think on coming home now. Just leave the Army and walk home before you get into a battle and they shoot you apart." Like most of the men, Charlie doubted there ever would be a battle. Minnesota was mostly wild then, with Sioux and Chippewa Indians in the north and west, and there were some frontier forts on the edge of the wilderness to deal with any difficulties. These posts were manned by regular Army troops, which Lincoln needed now to fight in the war, and there was talk in the ranks that the Minnesota Volunteers would be used to replace the Army troops at the frontier forts so the regular Army could go east to fight. "It'll be all mosquitoes and muck," a corporal named Massey said during a break in drilling one afternoon. "They don't let me go fight the rebels, and I might pull foot and leave." It was all rumor, of course, but what with his mother's letters, she wrote more often all the time of deserting, the boredom of constant drilling in the hot sun, and now the talk of being sent to relieve the frontier forts so that the regular Army troops could go fight the rebels. One company had already begun starting on the march north to the forts. Charlie was nearly on the edge of leaving when on June 22nd they were called into formation, ordered to get all their gear, and marched to the river where steamboats were waiting to take them to St. Paul. There they marched through towns with great fanfare. They still didn't have proper uniforms, but they had all been issued red flannel shirts, and though these shirts were as hot as original sin, as Charlie heard them described, at least the men looked like a unit, marching with shouldered rifles and hats cocked forward. Girls waved flags and people yelled, "Go it, boys! Get the rebels, and don't stop till you hit Richmond." In a short time, they boarded other steamboats that took them south and east to La Crosse, Wisconsin, where trains were waiting for them. It was all new to him. Charlie had never ridden on a steamboat, never marched in a parade, or had pretty girls wave flags for him and hand him sweets. Now, as he boarded the train and saw the plush seats and fancy inside of the car, he thought, I just never imagined such a thing existed. It was, all in all, a simply grand way to go off to go fight a war. And that's the end of it.